Dust and grime are not generally the things I like to show off to my friends when they're checking out my PC build, and I think this board fits that description. It's fairly just nasty, for lack of a better word. There's dust caked up in places that you probably wouldn't expect it, but when you go without cleaning your system for well over a year and your case doesn't have great dust prevention measures, maybe there's just not dust filters in place, maybe the case is just super restrictive, or maybe you're running a negative pressure setup inside, that's when dust just starts caking up, these components caking up these VRM heat sinks, this chipset heat sink. You'll get dust on top of your PCIe slots. It gets fairly excessive. Now, I know this is not the dirtiest motherboard out there, but it is a fairly dirty one. And if it looks anything like this, or maybe dirtier, you might want to consider cleaning it. That's what this video is for. Stay with me.
Corsair's 5000 series cases provide exceptional airflow and plenty of mounting space for up to dual 360mm radiators in multiple locations. The sleek aesthetic will complement any build, and the variety of models offered will cover multiple PC budgets. If you're looking for a mid-tower that pretty much does it all, consider the Corsair 5000D, 5000D Airflow, and 5000X IQ variants via the link below.
Now, by this point, if you have not seen our PCDC playlist, you're missing out. Check it out up here first. But we deep clean viewer PCs in them, and a lot of motherboards that we've cleaned up look something like this. So you've probably seen me actually, physically cleaning a board in one of those videos, although usually it's a time lapse, so it's sped up and I'm not walking you through step by step how I do things, how far down I tear these components to get to that bare board, because that's really what gets neglected at the end of the day, is the board underneath a lot of these heat sinks and things, these little plastic covers you tend to see on newer motherboards especially. When you're just blasting, your full-on assembled build with a can of air, sure, you're getting surface dust, but you're not getting underneath. You're not getting the real grime. That's where it gets built up long-term. And by that point, once it is grimy enough, a shot of compressed air, it's not going to get that grime up. So to prevent that in the future and to eliminate any of it if it exists currently, I like to take everything I can off of the motherboard, starting first with the VRM heatsinks and the chipset heatsinks. You might have more than one VRM heatsink. In this case, this is an X99 board. We just have one VRM MOSFET heatsink up top. We have, of course, our chipset heatsink down here. There are no, there are no fans in these. This is not an X570 chipset, so no active cooling was needed there. So this will be fairly easy to remove as well. And of course, if we had any plastic cover over our rear IO ports, we'd also want to remove that because these can get very grimy. But before I get ahead of myself, how do I clean these things? What do I use? Well, you're going to want to start with some isopropyl alcohol. This stuff will be your friend for the entire video. If you've seen the PCDC playlist already, you know I use this stuff habitually. It is great for getting up grime. It is also not going to damage any of your components. This alcohol actually evaporates very fast, and it is not conductive. There's no water in it, especially if you're buying the 99.9% stuff like I have here. Some Q-tips. I like to use Q-tips in combination with the IPA to really get into those fine spaces, is very small enclosed areas. You can get around SMDs a lot easier with those as well. Now, some people swear by using things like brake cleaner and some anti-static brushes. That's totally you're right. You can do whatever you want to do as long as you're using safe materials around these components. I'm all for it. And if you can get a thorough cleaning as well using those tools, be my guest. For cleaning larger surfaces, I like to use shop towels or even paper towels. Sometimes even toilet paper will do, although those things will tend to fray and spread a bit over the surface at hand. To clean those little bits, I like to use an electric blower. Now, a can of compressed air will work just fine, but if you're cleaning these rather regularly, it makes sense in my eyes to buy an electric duster like this one. And lastly, you'll want a toolkit. You could go with an iFixit toolkit if you want to spend a bit more money. I go with the cheap options just because I'm paying for this stuff out of pocket, and frankly, they all kind of do the same job. This right here comes with many different screw heads, so that if you're running into Torx bits or Allens or even just regular old Phillips or flatheads, all of that is here in this kit. You've also got a ton of pry tools baked into here as well. So this will be useful for removing thermal pads right under the VRM MOSFET heat sinks. Maybe have one under your PCH heatsink as well. But you've got a lot in here. This is great for tearing apart phones and things as well. I have this link below if you're interested. But again, if you already have like an iFixit toolkit or something, this is pretty much the same thing, just on a budget. All right, so that is about everything. Again, you can find all of these cleaning tools linked in the video description if you're interested in checking out any of those. But for now, let's get to cleaning the motherboard. So you'll want to start first with disassembly. That includes removing the CPU and RAM. These are the two easier things to remove on motherboards. So we're going to pull back on these retention arms. This here, if you're interested, is a is it a Core i7 or Core i9? I can't remember. 6800K. We will clean the CPU in a second. What I like to do is reuse the socket cover. This will keep our socket clean and prevent us from doing anything stupid. It will result in bending some of these pins. It's especially important with these LGA motherboards. So I've got that cover back in. Okay, there we go. So now our socket is safe. There's really, I mean, unless we really smash it with something, there's no risk of us damaging any of these pins. We're gonna remove the RAM next. He just has 2 sticks in here. 1 and 2. All right, the next things to remove will be the PCH heatsink, if you really want to call this a heatsink, it's just a metal slab, and then also the VRM MOSFET heatsink up here. Now, in this motherboard, they are held in, let's see if I can flip it around here. They are held in by screws. In some cases, they'll be held in by little like retention pegs, and you need to get something like a set of needle nose pliers and squeeze those pegs together and then pull from the top side of the board down at the same time. That'll release that peg from the back side of the motherboard, and you'll be able to remove those heat sinks that way. But in this case, up top, we've got 2 smaller Phillips screws to take care of. So that's 1. Set these aside. You can mark these, label them with tape, what have you, keep them separated so that you know where these go when reassembling. We'll just kind of get at it from underneath here. There we go. So this actually has thermal pads. I'm not sure the camera's going to show that, but thermal pads on the back side of the motherboard for these here. So this is usually not the case in most boards. And again, we have 4 larger Phillips screws here on the bottom of this particular board. We'll want to keep these separated from the smaller ones. Be careful, don't want to push too hard here. If you notice that you're going to start stripping the screw, you need to step up the size of the screw head that you're using. 1 more. You may want to put your hand underneath just in case the heatsink falls, although, yep, just did there. Not going to hurt anything though, it's just falling straight down and it's not falling very far. All right, slowly flip the board back over. That PCH heatsink has already come off. Okay, and then this heatsink should pry off with just a tad bit of force. Pull straight up, there we go. All right, so we removed the heat sinks on this board, and at first glance, I don't think there is anything else that we can reasonably remove. We do have these metal heat sinks to take care of first, and then once these are clean, we'll move on to the board itself. We'll also clean the CPU. We'll dust the RAM if the RAM needs dusting, probably does if your motherboard does. Now, and then we will work to reassemble all of it. Now, if any of your heat sinks still have the thermal pads attached, take a little pry tool or just a little scraper, something that you can wedge between the thermal pad and the sink itself. Just kind of wedge it around. Once you get it up enough, usually you can just carefully pull it. Don't want to tear these. There we go. This one's pretty dusty, but we're going to reuse it. I'll show you how to clean those in a second. So now we have pretty much just bare metal. And for this, we'll want our electric duster. And we're ready to lock and load. Now, chances are the duster didn't get rid of all of the dust and grime, just the stuff on the surface. To get inside these small little crevices you can see in this one here, I like to use these narrow Q-tips. I'll wedge it in as far as I can. If I can't get all the way in, I'll still try to use the brush on the duster to get through that, at least kind of disrupt it, move it around a bit so that it becomes loose and we can blow it out. But I'll use these with isopropyl alcohol. I have some here in the cap. And I'll start running it over the surfaces that are especially grimy. There are quite a few of those on this heatsink alone. We'll also repeat this process for the PCH heatsink. It's pretty much the same process both times. And if your Q-tip looks like this afterward, good job. Now there's quite a bit of the frayed Q-tip left on this heatsink, so we're just gonna take our duster one more time and clean this stuff off. All right, and as you can see, looking much cleaner now. There are a few small chips. We can't obviously get rid of those. We could just paint over them, paint correct them, what have you, even use a Sharpie if we wanted to do something quick and dirty. But overall, looking much nicer now. Now in this chipset heatsink, you can see that thermal paste was used, whereas in a lot of cases you'll find thermal pads being used. We want to clean this up with IPA and a Q-tip or shop towel. Also clean it up on the actual chipset side, which is on the board. I'll show you in a second. And then once this is clean, we can take our electric duster to it. Now the paste on the heatsink side was extremely difficult to remove. I actually ended up having to use one of my pry tools to kind of scrape it off. It was that old, it was that crusty. You can tell this had never been changed. The PCH side of it wasn't too bad cleaning this off of the die, the surface of the chipset. It wasn't as difficult. Again, just hit it with IPA. Try to clean it up as best you can. Do note that this TIM is not conductive, at least it shouldn't be. So if you do have a bit of excess running over into these smaller SMDs around the die itself, shouldn't be an issue long term. So we're gonna hit the chipset heatsink with the duster and then clean it with IPA. Same process as before. I'll kind of skip through this time. And that is one good looking slab of metal. Now for these pesky thermal pads, there's no real easy way to say this. You don't want to damage the pads, especially if you don't have replacements, right? If you have replacements and they're the correct thickness, then just ignore this step, scrap these old ones and just replace them with the new ones at the correct lengths. The problem is if you don't have replacements, and let's be honest, most people probably don't, you're going to be stuck just manually scraping this excess dust away from these pads. Being careful not to damage the pads themselves. You don't want to split these, let these crack. You could end up with pretty large gaps over the VRM MOSFET that can be damaging long term, or just prevent higher clocks. So be careful, try to clean this up as best you can, but if at the end of the day you have a bit of dust still remaining, I mean, there's not much more you can really do here. Next up, let's go ahead and clean our CPU and RAM. And I like to start with the CPU here. See, there's a lot of old thermal paste stuck to this, which is not good for the temps long term. So we're gonna replace this with fresh TIM. But get most of that off with a paper towel, and any remaining stuff you can hit at with IPA and either the same paper towel or just some Q-tips. I'll probably use the latter here. So let me get a Q-tip. Clean around the edges of the chip. A lot of thermal paste will tend to run over the sides of these CPUs. Maybe not this one. This is a larger IHS than most chips. It's an X99 chip. But you know, do your best, clean it up as best you can. Maybe blast it with a bit of air. There you go. Chip's looking much better already. Now I like to hit these with air first, get rid of any of that loose dust. At first glance, these don't look super dirty, so I think just the electric duster will do. Now if you notice, these modules have little openings on the tops of each, and that's where dust can get trapped, right between the little heat spreader here and the physical board itself. So you want to blast air down in between these as well as the sides of each. So make sure that you're thoroughly cleaning them there. And then hit with IPA and some Q-tips if you want to get in between some of these finer crevices. Some RAM kits out there are just super crazy, but these are fairly straightforward. They look much cleaner already. Now it's time to clean the actual motherboard itself, and this will involve a two-step process. So first I like to hit it with the electric duster. We're going to get rid of all that loose dust. Again, you can see there's a ton of dust caked up here. This is likely from the graphics card, which if you watched that episode in the PCDC playlist, you see that graphics card was pretty grimy. So a lot of dust here. There's going to be dust in a few other places. Remember, the board stands upright, so dust will fall onto the tops of these PCIe slots. It'll fall on top of the DIMM slots here. It'll fall on top of each of these rear I/O ports as well. So we'll want to give a bit of emphasis to cleaning from the top down, blowing air from the top of the board, because that's where most of the dust will collect. But anyway, we're going to start with the duster. Here we go. And once we're done with that, bring out the Q-tips and some IPA and start scrubbing the areas that need it the most. Again, I'm going to emphasize the tops of each where the dust will typically collect. I also like to emphasize the PCI slots. And then we'll move on to the rear I/O. You not only want to clean the exteriors of each of these housings, but you also want to clean inside each of the ports with IPA. It's not going to harm anything inside, but dust will get caked up in between the connection interfaces. And we want to make sure that our board is thoroughly cleaned. Of course, that includes these connections. Now when tackling rear I/O again, work especially on the tops of each of these little housings for the USB ports and the like. A lot of dust will accumulate up here. You can see how dirty that Q-tip already is, soaking in that dust. This is dust, mind you, that was not picked up by the electric duster, which is why I think it's important that you run through this stuff with IPA or brake cleaner, something similar to that, as long as it doesn't harm the components. We'll clean the tops of each. And then here at the end, we'll clean inside of each port, get the dust out of each of these USB ports. So this is the RJ45 port. Be gentle in here. Clean the top of the housing, clean the backs of each. See how dirty that is, that Q-tip. So we're gonna switch sides. Okay, looks good. Now you might notice that the IPA leaves sort of like a swirl mark in a lot of this thin steel. So just get another Q-tip, leave it dry. You can kind of run over it, brush over it. That'll give it more of a polished look in the end, even though at this point we're probably getting pretty picky here. But I don't like seeing swirl marks in my metal. And this is also a good check to make sure that you've thoroughly cleaned the surface. And there's a bit of dust on this one here, but there shouldn't be too much. If there is, it means we didn't do a good enough job cleaning with IPA the first time around. I think we're about done with the rear I/O now. See? Not so bad. And lastly, we have the back of the motherboard to take care of. I don't usually focus too much on the back, mainly because you don't see it, but also because it doesn't get very dusty back here. We have one clump of dust that's stuck to some of these soldering points in the back, but for the most part, this can be addressed with just the electric blower. And there we go, a dust-free rear. Now to set things back up, we're gonna reapply our thermal pads to the bottoms of our VRM heat sinks. Again, in this case, we only have one to take care of. Make sure that that's lined up correctly. We've also got this little retention bracket behind the board to take care of. So we'll align this. This is where the screws are gonna thread through. And we'll wanna position this underneath. I like to do this with the board facing down. You can do this the other way around as well, as long as you're holding one against the other. All right, so I can see the threads aligning. Take care of the smaller screws. You'll want to cross tighten just to make sure that you're getting even distribution by the end of it. So I tighten one halfway, and I'll tighten the other one fully, and then I'll come back to this one and I'll finish tightening it. There we go. And if we flip this board back around, heatsink should be positioned correctly, and it is. Looks great. Now remember, for the chipset, we need to reapply thermal paste a very, very small amount here because this die is very small. We're just gonna dab a tiny bit on top of this. We'll spread it out. There we go. Make sure to align the holes. Again, you could do this upside down as well. I'll switch things up just so that you can see what it's like doing things both ways. And then you'll want to pick the board up, screw things in from the back. Again, you want to make sure that you cross tighten here. And with the board flipped back over, tackle remaining hardware. In this case, it would be the RAM. So slots, 7 and 5 here. Be the first two that we populate. We only have 2 modules, so this will be where we take care of things. And lastly, our CPU. These CPUs actually install upside down, funny enough. So it'll be like so. And we can leave this little socket cover on while we do this next part, and this should just pop right off. There we go. I wouldn't say that it looks brand new. There are, again, a few chips, a few paint issues here and there. Not going to affect performance at all. Not a big deal. But these heat sinks definitely look a lot better than they did before. The motherboard overall looks like it belongs in a clean system. What do you think? Now, if you notice, I haven't mentioned the rear I/O shield. This isn't physically a part of the motherboard. Nonetheless, you could certainly clean this. I clean this in each of my PCDC videos. I don't recommend skipping out on it, but it's fairly straightforward when it comes to cleaning. You can either take a paper towel or some Q-tips, dip them in some IPA, and then just kind of scrub this down. You want to get the outside as well as the inside. The inside will get especially dusty as well, and it'll kind of help to allow dust to cake up, especially around these prongs and things. So give this a good clean, and then yeah, you'll be taken care of. I just didn't want to show this step because it's pretty much the same as the other steps. So if your board looks like this or something like this, congrats, it is fairly clean. I'm sure you could get even more detailed than I did, but this is about as far as I could reasonably go, especially if I want to clean multiple systems every month, which we've been able to do, thankfully, in the PCDC series. If you guys would like to, again, check out the tools that we use to clean all of our gear, check out the video description. They're all down there. Remember to test your board after you clean, especially after you reassemble these heat sinks and things. If you're careful, it should boot up without an issue, but if you don't get a boot and you did before you cleaned everything, maybe try reseating your CPU again, check the mounting pressure of your cooler on top of your CPU, especially in these X99 chips. They're very sensitive to those kinds of things I've found in my experience with them. And if all else fails, you killed your board. But again, I've been doing this for so long, I haven't had a single instance when a motherboard's been killed just from me cleaning it. Just be gentle. You want to be, you know, considerate of these smaller components on the board, and if you are, all should be well. With that, if you enjoyed the video, be sure to give it a thumbs up. I would appreciate that. Consider subscribing, leave a comment down below, and stay tuned for the next video. My name is Greg. Thanks for cleaning with me.